was formally introduced to childhood trauma after the suicide death of my son. See, I was familiar with the term trauma, but had no clue on the biological effects of it. Heightened stress levels, overstimulation of the nervous system, undeveloped brain structures. We didn't learn this in my school. See, in my community, we created our own diagnosis for our trauma response behavior. And what are those diagnoses? Oh, that'd be crazy. He off the hook, or them kids bad as hell. Childhood trauma is the worst natural disaster known to man. And you'd probably respond, well, isn't a natural disaster a harmful impact on the community following a natural hazardous event? And the answer is still yes. Let me explain. Growing up in environments with instability, abuse, neglect, and poverty can create trauma symptoms that looks like PTSD. Childhood trauma is the most pervasive issue this generation has ever seen, but yet we deal with it with kids' gloves. Exposure to excessive trauma has long-term consequences and prepares the body for a flight or fight response and releases cortisol that can be damaging to a child's development. Trauma causes the prefrontal cortex in children to become underactivated. Why is this important? This is the part of the brain that's responsible for concentration, learning, and attention. So when I realized how radical the issue of childhood trauma was, I decided that I would become a radical response. So I did a 48-hour hunger strike on the steps of our state house to launch the movement, a state of emergency on childhood trauma. I thought a movement like this would draw support from every community, religious, and political leader that represented areas highly affected. But I was wrong. I marched around the Capitol like a one-man army. I knew that the stakes were too high for me to give up, so I decided that I would become the army, the fight for childhood trauma alone. After I gained access into the Capitol, I forced my way from a seat at the table to my place at the podium. I needed the world to understand how severe this issue was, even if I had to sacrifice my life starving in the freezing cold for 2 days. The purpose of my movement was to qualify childhood trauma for an emergency declaration. We can declare a state of emergency on everything else except for what directly affects us. Let me say that again. We can declare a state of emergency for everything else except for what directly affects us. We declared a state of emergency on opioids while forgetting that addiction is rooted in trauma. It's like eating the icing off the cake and leaving the rest untouched. Here's an unknown fact too. Outside of weather damage, there has never been an emergency declaration on anything that impacts communities of color. Never. We live in a world where the gatekeepers owns the program for a sustainable childhood trauma influenced economic cash flow, i.e. private prisons. The names of our children don't matter when they're printed on multiple Child Protective Service documents or school disciplinary reports. Their names don't ring any alarms when they go without proper diets because they live in a food desert. But as soon as their trauma expresses itself, oh, now their names matter. But only to sensationalize it on the news. Violence, broken families, impoverished communities, low academics. These are all expressions of trauma. But see, it's easier to entertain the colorful images on social media than to address the root cause. There's a book called Childhood Disrupted, and it talks about how our biography becomes our biology. See, we live and experience childhood trauma on a biological level. I sadly learned, though, after reading this book that the ACEs study, a program that was created to help measure trauma levels, didn't include many people of color or issues that my community primarily suffers from. The study was conducted with 75% whites and only 5% African Americans. Childhood trauma is also a systematic issue. A friend of mine, he's a lifelong conservative, once told me, policy is what got us here, and policy is what's going to get us out. In 2012, Attorney General Eric Holder's task force on children exposed to violence declared the problem a national crisis and a threat to the health and well-being of our children and our nation. But even early 30 years prior, the U.S. Surgeon General Richmond referred to the same problem, now get this, as a public health crisis of the highest priority. But yet, we still haven't declared a state of emergency. People ask me, well, what happens if it is declared? The same thing that happened when it was declared for opioids, COVID, and even vaping. Yeah, you probably didn't know. An emergency declaration was given for vaping pens. When an issue is given this type of policy, it's prioritized on the highest level. A politician once asked me, he said, isn't there wraparound programs that could take care of the mental health and trauma issues in your community? So I asked him, I said, isn't there wraparound programs that could deal with the opioids issue in your community? In the state of Ohio, we have over 1,200 addiction services. But we still declared a state of emergency on it. His response was dead silence. We can't heal from what we don't know what we're sick from. Declaring a state of emergency on childhood trauma will create generational healing for entire communities. But what do I know? I was just conceived by rape, beaten until blood was drawn from my little body before I was 10 by my adoptive father, forced to do robberies with my biological father to support his crack addiction, and dropped out of school in the 10th grade. I spent multiple years in my early 20s in prison. And after my release, I went to job placement programs trying to find sustainable work, but it was all the same, factory or minimum wage jobs. I knew that if I was going to have an opportunity to live an abundant life, it was only going to come through entrepreneurism. I slept on a park bench behind a clinic. And when the nights got cool, I slept in the alleyway next to a heating duct. I spent my days writing a business plan to raise the startup capital. And in a few short months, I went from being homeless to starting my first business that elevated me financially and socially. I thought my story was that of an overcomer. Overcoming was easier to explain to my community than childhood trauma was. The dynamics of this issue has been so capsulated and symbolized that we can't even see that the world is on fire. Society has normalized, desensitized, and criminalized childhood trauma. And why not? Left untreated, it's a $1 trillion industry. In the Declaration of Independence, it reads that Americans have a right to life, liberty, and a pursuit of happiness. But how? Some of our largest communities are stuck in survival mode. In my second book, The Face of Trauma, I wanted to be very transparent on how childhood trauma impacted my long-term health. I battle daily with chronic fatigue, anxiety, and fibromyalgia. There's very little to no data that exists for fibromyalgia. And out of all of the research, it's still considered a controversial diagnosis. But what they did discover is that it's a malfunction of the nervous system. And what's been proven to have a direct impact on the nervous system? Childhood trauma. In closing, we're at war in our bodies, and childhood trauma is the culprit. We have a chance to make history by declaring a state of emergency on childhood trauma. Our children suffer at no fault of their own. Radical times calls for radical leadership. Thank you.